Okay, welcome to this discussion looking at the impact of China's Belt and Road Initiative, lessons from Sri Lanka. The meeting draws on a report Chatham House published earlier this year, looking at the Chinese investment in the Belt and Road Initiative in Sri Lanka. And we have two of the co-authors of the report from the Lakshman Kadirgama Institute of International Relations and Strategic Studies in Sri Lanka to contribute to our discussion today. We'll start off with Ganeshan Wignaraja, Executive Director of the LKI, looking at the economic impacts of Chinese investment in Sri Lanka. We'll then turn to Danusha Pandiraratne, Non-Resident Fellow and former Executive Director at LKI. And then we'll have some comments from two other distinguished panelists. Alyssa Ayres, Senior Fellow for India, Pakistan and South Asia at the Council of Foreign Relations in the United States. So thank you for giving your time so early in the morning. And Lee Jones, Reader in International Politics at Queen Mary University of London. So if I can turn to you, Ganeshan, first, would you like to talk through some of the findings of the report, and in particular the economic impacts of Chinese investments in Sri Lanka?
Thank you, Gareth. I'd like to make 4 points to set the stage. The first point is really that the updated data show that Sri Lanka is really just a medium level recipient of Chinese infrastructure investment rather than a large recipient. We note that having painstakingly gathered the data, Sri Lanka received some $12.4 billion of Chinese infrastructure investment between 2006 and mid-2020. This is about 13.5% of GDP, which is much less than the big BRI recipients in Asia, such as Pakistan, Laos, Cambodia, and so on. The point we make on the recommendation is that we need much better data on Chinese development finance to Sri Lanka, and indeed the same for all other donors. The second point I want to briefly mention is that there have been economic benefits of such investment to Sri Lanka, particularly because Sri Lanka has had a relatively poor record for a middle-income country of infrastructure development. Chinese investment typically provided some $36 billion, Sri Lanka's unmet infrastructure needs are some $36 billion over this period. And if you subtract out the Chinese investment, Sri Lanka's unmet needs come down to some $23 billion. So the $12 billion adds that kind of interest. In terms of expressways, Chinese investment built some 2/3 of all the expressways in Sri Lanka and led to better connectivity and enhanced safety. In terms of ports, the Chinese investment built the state-of-the-art terminal at Colombo Port and enabled Colombo Port to develop into a major transshipment hub for the Indian market. In terms of energy, Chinese investment have contributed to a major power plant and give something like 1/3 of the power generation of Sri Lanka. But of course, there are some projects that are not so good. For instance, the telecom tower called the Lotus Tower seems to be a work in progress. There is Mattale Airport, which has not got much traffic. And we highlight the need really for rigorous cost-benefit analysis and infrastructure master planning as a major recommendation. The third point I want to make is the fact that China has engulfed Sri Lanka in a debt trap is not supported by the data on debt dynamics. Sri Lanka's total debt to GDP ratio is some 87%, which means Sri Lanka is approaching this magical number of 90% threshold of debt to GDP put forward by the economists Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff, above which a country's growth would slow. But Sri Lanka's general debt problem is not made in China. The data show on total public debt, external public debt, we owe some $6 billion to China, which is out of some $37.4 billion total external public debt. We owe much more to financial markets and also to the Asian Development Bank and other bilateral donors. This is really explained by Sri Lanka's graduation away from concessionary aid towards foreign borrowing in US dollars, a historic problem of twin deficits, and a low capital to output ratio. Now, obviously, we should prudently avoid a Chinese debt trap in the future, We need to improve our debt management system to reduce vulnerabilities of debt and much more transparency. We should request a moratorium on interest payments of Chinese debt for 3 years to facilitate debt sustainability. And we should increase our share of infrastructure finance from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and others that offer raw procurement costs as well as high standards. The last point I want to mention is that there is evidence of other macroeconomic costs from Chinese infrastructure investment, particularly in terms of trade deficits and a lack of spillovers. And this is really related to the enclave nature of Chinese infrastructure investment projects. And really the policy implication is that Sri Lanka should invest more in China as well as get foreign investment from China and do a major export push to get Sri Lankan exports into the Chinese market. And that really means understanding the Chinese export market, as well as cutting red tape and doing a lot of other regulatory reforms. So basically, in conclusion, Chinese investment, like all infrastructure investment, entails costs and benefits at the project level and in the macroeconomic level. And the development challenge for countries like Sri Lanka is how to maximize the potential while minimizing the costs. And we offer some elements in our paper of a coherent strategy and lessons for others. Thank you very much, Gareth.
Thank you for being so concise and yet comprehensive. Plenty to dig into here. And for participants, I just reiterate, please do send in questions and answers as we go through. Let me turn to Danusha. Do you want to talk through the wider political, strategic implications and the implications on Sri Lankan politics also?
Thank you, Gareth. Yeah, I'll basically address 3 points to follow on from Ganesh's very comprehensive economic analysis. The first thing I wanted to do is situate Chinese investment into the broader context or framework of Sri Lanka's foreign policy. Historically, Sri Lanka has in principle maintained a non-aligned foreign policy, while in practice it has swung between Western and non-Western partners depending on the political party in power. I think what's notable in regard to Chinese investment is that it has Chinese investment has in fact defied or gone against this traditional swinging and become a constant of Sri Lanka's foreign policy and economic development. And that was quite apparent after 2015, when Chinese investment was expected to take a backseat. It did so only very briefly and temporarily before returning to quite high levels by 2016 and continuing a high level of development after that. And in this new context of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think while Sri Lanka will seek developmental assistance from a wide variety of bilateral and multilateral partners, in practice, it is likely to receive relatively more from China than Western partners. The second aspect I wanted to touch on was, I mean, Ganesh sort of addressed the debt trap narrative and the problems of that. One of the sort of non-economic problems of the debt trap narrative is that it can obscure the details about the local impact of Chinese investment. I mean, the debt trap narrative is an external narrative, and so it doesn't pay attention to sort of the local concerns and how local governments want to handle Chinese investment. So recipient countries like Sri Lanka know now that Chinese investment is here to stay. They're not really asking how to do away with that investment, but rather how to make it better on the ground. And some of the things that the report brings out is, for example, in relation to Chinese labor, there's a perception of high reliance on Chinese labor that is so with certain projects, but with the port projects, for example, less than 5% of labor at the CICT terminal at the Colombo port and at the Hambantota port, less than 5% of workers are Chinese. What has been more concerning, I think, is a lack of knowledge or skill transfer at the middle management level and above, and there really needs to be a plan to ensure that Sri Lankan workers, benefit from that skill transfer. The report makes several suggestions to augment the impact of Chinese investment. Just to give you one example, it does make a proposal for a long-term, a minimum 20-year evidence-based infrastructure development plan. The current infrastructure development plans of Sri Lanka have been quite short, 5 years usually, sometimes 10 years, but we look at countries like Indonesia, New Zealand, and Netherlands, they have minimum 20-year plans that are highly evidence-based, taking into account factors like demographic shifts, climate change, need for digital connectivity in different regions, and digital security, and mapping all of those for a very long term, and doing that mapping in a bipartisan or multi-partisan matter. That would maximize the utility of future projects, and I think would also discourage ad hoc suggestions for potentially unnecessary and unfeasible projects that tend to come as different governments change. One aspect I wanted to touch on, which is brought out by the report, is the impact of Chinese investment on democratic institutions in Sri Lanka. China is definitely not a liberal democracy, and so there have been concerns about what that impact would be in Sri Lanka. What we've seen is that China has learned to adapt to democratic change, and that was evident particularly in its rapid rapprochement with the previous coalition government following the 2015 election, and also currently through its increasing public diplomacy through a variety of means, including increasing corporate social responsibility, CSR acts of Chinese companies in Sri Lanka. And just to give you one example of that, the Port City project has deployed about $3 million in funds over the last couple of years to support over 9,000 fishing families that are affected by the Port City. That said, there are a number of recommendations the report does make, including a need to prohibit foreign political donations. Sri Lanka is one of the very few countries not to do so, and I think that decreases public trust in foreign investments. And there's also, if I can just close by the observation that although it's commonly assumed that Chinese investment is somehow antithetical to democratic institutions, and certainly that's something we need sort of to watch the progression of, there is some room for convergent interests that countries need to sort of grab. And to give you one example, there were lots of stories and incidences of racial discrimination on the part of Sri Lankans against Chinese workers during the time of COVID. The fact that such racial discrimination did rear its head indicates there is actually a Chinese interest in ensuring that institutions which work against racial discrimination in this country are supported, and there are many national institutions to that effect.
Thank you very much, Danusia. Again, plenty to come back to. Let's turn to Alyssa Ayres. I'd be interested in the view from the US of Chinese investments in Sri Lanka and beyond, and perhaps clearly at a time of heightened tension between the US and China. Maybe if you have any thoughts on US plans to counter Chinese investments, but over to you.
Well, let me first offer some of my thoughts on, I thought this was an excellent report, and I would commend it to anybody interested in the pattern of Chinese Belt and Road infrastructure investments. It's very helpful to get this deeper dive into Sri Lanka's larger debt picture, and the fact that against this larger backdrop of Sri Lanka's overall debt, a very large proportion of Sri Lanka's debt is domestic, and then its external debt, actually there's a piece of it that is to China. It is not that China dominates the picture, and I think this report provides more of a detailed understanding of that picture. I would note that this is a finding also that a report that came out from the U.S. Institute of Peace done by Nilanthi Saranayaka several months back also came to similar conclusions about the proportion of China's debt. So I think this is an important kind of top line that really should become better known, because as the authors have noted, the debt trap narrative is the one that now I think is commonly understood internationally. But I would also add that you know, in a pretty visible way, and I think for obvious reasons, the case of the Hambantota port does, I think, illustrate a difference in the way that China's infrastructure lending and its infrastructure packages are dissimilar to those from multilateral banks. Lack of conditions appears to be a major one. The fact of this 99-year lease, equity swap, whatever we want to call it, is another major difference. I just can't imagine something like that happening through an ADB loan or through any other kind of multilateral bank loan. So this is clearly something that I think puts these types of infrastructure loans in a different category. One of the observations that the report makes, and I think this is also important to put it in the context of South Asia and how important the challenges South Asian countries face when it comes to Chinese Belt and Road infrastructure investment and what it means for economies. This report makes the observation that Sri Lanka is actually less indebted to China on these types of infrastructure loans than Pakistan and Maldives. And to that, I would say absolutely. In fact, we should be looking at all of this in terms of a broader pattern. Pakistan is in the process right now of trying to renegotiate its loan payments. In fact, at the end of May, there was a big audit done on power sector projects that found, and this has become a big issue for Pakistan with its relationship with China and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, of course, the largest spur of the Belt and Road. This audit report that came out in Pakistan determined that many of the financing line items were in fact overbilled, and that Pakistani taxpayers were being asked to essentially pay padded figures. And so this is quite a scandal that's unfolding in the way that loans are structured and billed. And that gets back to another one of the observations that this report makes, which is the utility of labor and employment on the ground, the lack of skills transfer. I think these are actually quite important findings. The trade deficit finding and the skills transfer finding, I think, point to an area where countries that do seek infrastructure financing, whether loans or grants, ought to be more attentive to what they are going to receive and benefit from as a result of these kinds of financing. And I think that this report makes that quite clear, and that should also be a top line. The final point I would make on this front, coming directly out of this report, is that I think, you know, if you look around at the process of multilateral banks and financing, there are guardrails there in the sense of feasibility studies, the economic feasibility of a project, the social impact feasibility of a proposed project, the environmental feasibility of a project, and these take place prior to project approval. And that pattern takes a long time, for one, so that's why these studies and evaluations can drag out for years prior to financing being authorized. But on the other hand, it does ensure that you don't end up financing an airport that has no flights, or, you know, something, a project that cannot be economically viable because that advance work was done before approval of a project. That kind of a process also eliminates sort of political loan making done as a favor or done because somebody asks for it. So this missing piece, I think it points to a way to be thinking about how the United States and other countries that are interested in finding ways to support, but not necessarily bankroll the entirety of infrastructure financing, should be looking at ways to help expedite these processes, because there is an obvious need. Countries around the world seek infrastructure finance. In Asia, it's particularly pronounced in developing Asia. And I think what you see as a result of the China Belt and Road experience is that writing loans, creating projects, getting loans in place without having done this kind of advanced evaluative work ends up taking things sometimes in a path that is not helpful for the country at large. You can see that with the Maldives as well, a smaller country, but in fact they just received a debt payment moratorium for 4 years on I believe $600 million of payments to China. I mean, these are real issues for countries. So I would just add there, as the United States tries to figure out its own role in this, we all know that the creation of the new International Development Finance Corporation is supposed to help provide some sort of a spur to private capital to help crowd in private investment in this space. This is all very new, so we'll see how it works. But I do think that some of the answer here is really taking a look at the advanced feasibility and a sort of more significant advanced assessment of these projects, but in a timely way.
Interesting thoughts. Let's turn to Lee Jones to get his insights.
Thanks, Gareth, and thank you for inviting me to help discuss this really excellent report. The thing that strikes me reading the report is how similar Sri Lanka is to so many other cases that I've looked at when studying Chinese development financing. The report, I'll quote from the conclusion of the report, quote, "The crucial development challenge for Sri Lanka is how best to ensure net benefits across the project portfolio of Chinese infrastructure investments." In other words, how can Sri Lanka gain benefits from Chinese engagement and minimize the downsides and the risk? And this is the problem facing all developing countries and developed countries, in fact, trying to engage with China. The report flags up that there is a real infrastructure need. There is real need in Sri Lanka and many parts of the developing world. But some projects, while some projects are successful, some are very poorly conceived and don't work out. And that problem is ultimately traceable to weak governance of these issues and the politicization of development planning on the Sri Lankan side. And I think those are unavoidable and they manifest in every single context. Chinese investment is weakly regulated on the Chinese side, and so it interfaces with governance problems on recipient side. And both of those sides produce the outcomes together. The crucial lesson is that you cannot rely on China to do your development planning for you. If you think you can just outsource those decisions about what is a good project and a bad project to China because they've been successful, you're overlooking the fact of massive surplus capacity in China because they have splurged too much money on infrastructure themselves, which is why they're trying to export their surplus capacity. So you have to solve your own problems at home. There's a real risk of unsustainable debt, as the report points out, but it's from all sources. There's a lot of hype around Chinese debt and lending to developing countries. But once you crunch the numbers, as this report does, you find out that in the majority of cases, with a few exceptions, like Laos, for example, China is actually a fairly marginal player, and the countries owe a lot more to, for example, international capital markets. And the debt crunch that Sri Lanka faced around 2016 was really to do with quantitative easing and the reining in of quantitative easing and the rising of interest rates for loans to developing countries. The crucial point again, though, is that you can't rely on China to do your due diligence and manage risk for you. They're not going to do that. If they think they can make a profit by lending to you and making money, and that's what their development banks want to do, then they will do that, especially if you shoulder the risk with sovereign debt guarantees. You have to put your own house in order. There are problems with ensuring local benefits. For example, employment, that you get some technology transfer and you get actual real quality employment for your people. The report flags, though, that the problem in the Sri Lankan case is a lack of skilled workers, which leads to the importation of Chinese workers. And again, we see that in many other countries. The problem is the lack of skills and education domestically. And also, as a report flags up, Chinese immigration is less than is typically suggested. There is often a sort of xenophobic populism that is whipped up by opportunistic political actors against Chinese immigration. We see this in places like Myanmar, Indonesia, several African countries as well. Another problem flagged in the report is environmental problems. There are serious environmental concerns around some projects, which is due to inadequate domestic regulation, inadequate domestic enforcement. But it's interesting that the report is very nuanced here. It finds that when high standards are insisted upon and best practices internationally are domesticated and enforced, then in Chinese projects, we see those high standards. The crucial point, again, is you cannot rely on China to regulate firms in your territory. The Chinese regulatory system for overseas investments and SOEs relies very heavily on recipient states, host state regulations still, despite the fact that they've tried to amend their regulations, to tighten them, to improve their performance and avoid the kind of backlashes that we've seen in a lot of developing countries. You can't rely on China to do it for you. And finally, the report discusses security problems. And I noticed that in the chat, several questions have come up predictably about the Hambantota port. I think the report is very measured on this. I think it could have made a stronger case that the geopolitical alarms around the Hambantota port have been exaggerated as part of an anti-Chinese political agenda hatched in New Delhi, in particular amplified in Washington. It is the case that the vast majority of Chinese development financing is not strategically directed. And in fact, the governance structures on the Chinese side to make sure that China's vast development financing portfolio is used for specific geopolitical ends, financing infrastructure that it then wants to grab for its own navy or something like that. The development financing regime in China is simply not geared to that. And when you start unpicking these headline cases like the Hambantota port, which myself and Shahar Hamiri do in a forthcoming report for Chatham House, you see in fact that all of the discourses around that port are completely wrong. Everything you think you know about Hambantota port is wrong. And this report goes some way to addressing that issue. So there's a very good couple of paragraphs on the security implications of Hambantota port that, in fact, there has been no Chinese military activity at the port. The only port visits have been by American and Indian naval vessels. The port is subject to supervision and inspection by the US Coast Guard as part of the International Port Security Framework. The Sri Lankan Navy has hundreds of personnel stationed at the port, and there are plans to shift the Navy's Southern Command to Hambantota port. Ownership of the port could go further on this point. Ownership of the port has not been transferred to China. There has been no equity swap. There is simply a lease for 99 years. And the Sri Lankan government has rights under the agreement to buy back the lease at various points in time under certain pre-agreed arrangements. There has been no debt for equity swap. The loans that the Sri Lankan government took out to fund the Hambantota port are still owed. The debt is in place. The investment that came in, as this report points out, from China merchant ports was used to stabilize Sri Lanka's balance of payments and pay off expensive, mostly Western creditors, because that was the real debt trap that Sri Lanka had got itself into. So yeah, I really do commend this report. I think it's full of fascinating detail, and it flags up many problems for development financing, Chinese development financing, not only in Sri Lanka, but in developing countries worldwide.
Thank you, Lee. Can I come straight to you with a question which relates to Alicia's point about the lack of cost-benefit analysis? And I'd like to turn to Ganeshan with the same question afterwards, which is one of the selling points of the new donors, including China, including India, is that they're not interfering. They're just doing what governments have requested that they do. And obviously, if the governments haven't done the cost-benefit analysis correctly, you can end up with white elephants. Now, clearly, I followed the example of India's development assistance much more, and you have seen a kind of learning process whereby they don't interfere, but they do have structures in place just to double check that some assistance is actually going to benefit and not constructing presidential palaces, for instance, which became, in India's case, one example became the issue. Have you seen, and again, I'll turn to Ganeshan with the same question, any learning in China's development assistance?
Yeah, you definitely do. I mean, the arguments about Chinese imperialism and China undermining democratic governments and using its investment for strategic purposes is not a new one. It's been around now for about 15 years when the alarm started to be raised about Chinese activity in Africa. And what you see after every period in which there's a significant backlash, especially within partner countries, and if there's a diplomatic spat that arises or there's international pressure, is you see a learning process on the Chinese side. You have to remember that basically Chinese companies, with the exception of oil companies in the 90s and then hydropower dams a bit later on, Chinese state-owned enterprises, which are the ones that implement tide aid projects, are relative newcomers to international markets. They were at least relatively unsophisticated, very lightly and regulated in a light and fragmented manner. And the Chinese, they have this old cliche about crossing the river by feeding the stones. They do something, some of it works, some of it doesn't work so well. They try and tighten it up. And you can see after every significant pushback against China, there's an attempt to stamp out corruption in some places. They are trying to tighten environmental regulations, but it's still the case that Chinese regulations are below international best practices, and there's still a great deal of reliance on host state regulation. So they are learning because this isn't in their interests to have people banging on about debt trap diplomacy, to have diplomatic crises between themselves and other countries when a government changes and suddenly the political calculus changes and so on. The report goes into some detail about the soft power or public diplomacy offensive that we see in Sri Lanka. And we see that, again, that's a global phenomenon, which is a relatively new thing that they're engaged in, to try to realize that they can't just work with a few elites, some of whom may well be crooked and then be ousted from power. They need to develop a relationship with other actors in society. So they are on a learning curve, and it's a very steep one. So that is happening, but they are still well behind the standards of most multilateral development banks. That's certainly true.
If I might come in, Gareth.
Sure. Yes, please.
Two quick points. The first is capacity to use aid effectively is generally not very good in South Asia, and Sri Lanka is no exception. And so I think, half of the aid that's given isn't actually used, and then what exists, isn't as effective as we would want it. And that's another topic for a seminar at Chatham House, but that's one general problem. Definitely there has been some learning in terms of Chinese projects. The older projects were experimental. The scale was very different to many of the aid projects Sri Lanka has had today. The newer projects are much better in the way they're implemented. And actually the best two are the ones in process, which have been brought out by the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which has high standards. And my hope for Sri Lanka is that increasingly the Chinese portfolio shifts towards AIIB type projects, which have better procurement standards and better environmental and other regulations. And then I think China must help countries like Sri Lanka do proper infrastructure master planning on capacity building grounds, as well as much better cost-benefit analysis. And cost-benefit analysis is a very difficult exercise, to master. So that's what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you. We have around 10 minutes left, and we have quite a lot of questions to get through. I'm starting towards the top. The geographic spread of Chinese investment, has there been investment in the north and east of Sri Lanka? And is there, I guess, concern regarding tourism, concern regarding casinos and gambling as part of tourism investment? Ganeshan, could I turn to you again? You're on mute.
Yeah, Ganeshan, sorry, we're in the same room. I think one of the concerns about Chinese investment is the geographic concentration of investments in the south and the western province, and to some extent in the central provinces. And by contrast, Indian investment is much stronger in the north and east. And we saw, for example, last year the opening of the Jaffna Airport being supported by India. So I think that's a very valid question that's being asked. Sri Lanka's development partners, both India and China, do need to think about having to look at the whole of Sri Lanka as an investment opportunity, as a development opportunity, as a partnership opportunity.
There's a few questions from the audience along similar lines, which I hope I can paraphrase to say, what's the extent of concern about Chinese involvement in Sri Lankan politics?
I think that that is a concern. I mean, I think it's a concern locally, and it's a concern amongst the Sri Lankans abroad as well. So the report does make particular recommendations to address that concern. Chief among them is the prohibition I spoke of earlier on foreign political donations. It should not just apply to China, of course, it should be across the board. So that's certainly a concern. In terms of what active things that Sri Lanka can do about it is obviously to promote better transparency and better public awareness, because public trust is ultimately important for the success of these projects. So one of the things the recommendation suggests is that there be regular media updates and press briefings, for example, on each of the projects and what that involves, so that there's a sense of openness about what the projects involve and who is dealing with them, which ministries are dealing them, so that those are not left to any kind of suspicion.
Thank you. Alyssa, there's a question specifically for you about the Blue Dot Network and whether this could fill the gaps you're identifying. Ask for your...
Well, yeah, I mean, the Blue Dot Network as currently envisioned is like a seal of approval, like a good housekeeping. This is great infrastructure done properly. It's not a fund. And so the challenge here is finding a way to actually identify and mobilize funding that can help fill this big gap, and to do so in a way that meets the highest standards and that does this sort of advance evaluation and assessment to construct projects in the right way to deliver the greatest economic and social benefits to the country. So the Blue Dot Network is not designed to be like a big fund that will identify projects. Rather, it's designed to be a kind of agreed upon set of standards that countries will want to all sign on to, and therefore create a kind of mobilized sense of what good infrastructure investment looks like.
There's a question here, which strikes me as interesting. I'm not sure which of you to turn to, asking, has there been any shared learning from amongst countries who have received Chinese investment? Which is an interesting idea.
So China is now trying very hard to deal with the gaps in the Belt and Road, as well as maximizing the benefits. They're not doing this just as a geostrategic thing. This is really their gift to the world, as they sometimes say. And the Belt and Road Forum, last year, there was an attempt to look at a lot of criticism of Chinese projects. And I think gradually this filters through into the Chinese system. And I think we are getting better design projects now, and they're being more cautious if I also look at what Sri Lanka has got. And the newer projects, particularly those in the last 2 years, are certainly much better. So I think, but it takes the time to trickle down because of the nature of their system and the way in which they manage their aid. Thank you.
Thank you. The question regarding how prominent corruption is in Chinese investment. Ganesh, can I stick with you as a...
So, look, this is a very tricky issue, as in all aid projects. And there have been various allegations made of Sri Lankan projects, those in the Maldives, those in Pakistan. But the example of Pakistan is interesting. There was an audit report In some of the others, there is no evidence to suggest this or no evidence otherwise. And so, this is a very hard gray area. And until we have, forensic type investigation, it's very difficult to comment on this type of activity. Unlike the development banks, Chinese projects don't usually have, same types of safeguards on this way. And so we'll just have to wait till domestic laws and procedures come up with the answers. And I think that's the only thing that I can comment on.
Lee, I don't know if you'd be interested in commenting more generally on Chinese investment.
I can certainly say something about corruption. I mean, we have to remember that construction is probably the most corrupt sector of any part of the economy worldwide. And there are estimates saying that about a third of spending in the construction sector globally is basically skimmed off. So the sector itself is very much open to over padding and excessive bidding and opaque subcontracting and so on. So it's not specific to or limited to Chinese investment. This is a corrupt sector generally. Now, there is a specific issue around BRI because it's often, the big projects are often in countries with particular political economy problems where potentially corruption is a big problem and the bureaucratic systems are not sufficient to constrain that. So I think some of the recommendations in this report around, rational development planning and so on would be great if you could do that. But the truth is you can't take politics out of development planning. And what we see in the Sri Lankan case, I think, is the Mahinda Rajapaksa regime using Chinese investment as part of a broader strategy of pumping big prestige projects into politically important areas and deriving benefits from that for the regime and the Rajapaksa clan more generally. And that's by no means unique. The report that I mentioned that we're publishing, I think probably next month, also has the case of Malaysia, and that there some Chinese investment was intended to bail out the mega fraudulent 1MDB sovereign wealth fund. And the thing with the Chinese is they are willing to engage in those kinds of corrupt dealings in a way that other investors, or certainly multilateral development banks, would be much more squeamish about getting involved in that. And that goes to Alyssa's point about the difference of Chinese investment. So the thing is, it's the interface between this outbound investment from China, which is driven by some really important imperatives like excess surplus capacity on and that can often be a very toxic combination. And I think there's a limit to how much kind of technocratic capacity building and so on can really overcome those problems, because in the end, they are political problems in the host countries.
Thank you. Alyssa, can I give the last word to you and slightly reformulate one of the questions? The question relates to, is there a likelihood that Sri Lanka is going to find itself tilting towards China and away from the West? I'd be interested in your thoughts on the view in the United States, if that does start to be the case more generally amongst maybe not just Sri Lanka, but other countries. If they appear to be tilting towards China, what's the likely US response?
Well, we saw this pattern earlier in the 20 knots in the period from 2009 to 2015. I think there was a real sense that the earlier Rajapaksa government had definitively decided to put its eggs in China's basket, not only because China was a terrific infrastructure investing partner, as we all know, ask and you shall receive everything you want, but it also was a partner that didn't ask questions about the very important human rights issues still at play in Sri Lanka, and that have been one component, but an important focus of a lot of the West, and that has been Sri Lanka's lack of serious progress on reconciliation and accountability for what took place at the end of the conflict. And Dhanusha spoke a little bit about the political impact, but we certainly don't see China playing a human rights role anywhere in the world. And that is one reason that it is a palatable partner for investment, because they will not ask questions about, well, what's happening on the commitments you made to the UN Human Rights Council about reconciliation. Those questions just won't come up. So I guess I would see this issue of whether Sri Lanka tips towards China more or less as intimately related to the way other countries push Sri Lanka on the questions of making good on its promises to its own citizens, and whether progress has been made on that front or not.
Thank you, Alyssa. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you for sending in your questions. Apologies to those of you who I couldn't get through them all. And most of all, thank you to our panelists, Ganeshan Wignaraja, Dhanusha Pandaratne, Alyssa Ayres, and Lee Jones. Thank you.